Music is all around you. You very likely hear it every day, often at times when you'd much prefer just to have some silence. Sometimes this music finds you, like Phil Collins at the dentist's office, or a jingle from an advertisement that you'd pay to have erased from your memory. Other times, however, it's you that's finding the music, throwing on classical in the bath, or heavy metal when it's time for some extra motivation at the gym. And since listening can be such a passive activity, it's really easy to take for granted the way that we listen to music. And of course, there are multiple ways to listen to music. So just like you can watch a movie in a bunch of different ways, like as a fan, as a critic, just focusing on what the camera's doing, how a scene is framed, color, lighting, etc. You can also listen to music in different ways as well, in ways that will shift your perspective and hopefully level up your overall enjoyment of the music that you listen to. This will be a great video for anybody who wants to or is just getting into music listening as a hobby. Some of the stuff I'm going to recommend may seem a little bit obvious at first, but there's so much in what we listen to that can be right in front of our faces and go practically unnoticed. Now, as we move through our list of listening methods, we're going to experience increasingly involved and focused ways of listening to music. But as a palate cleanser, number 5 will be a lot more fun, a lot lighter, so stick around to the end for some bonus listening games that are fun at a record swap party with a partner or even just by yourself. And just quickly before we get into our first list item, if you're interested in the study of genre, the psychology of music, or just want to broaden your understanding of the music that you already love, please consider subscribing. It motivates me to create more stuff like this, and I really appreciate it. Now, onto our first listening method. Now, before we get into any of the more involved listening methods, I think we should start at the start. Now, this one's pretty easy. If you're a music listening hobbyist, this is probably the type of listening you do most often. And it's incredibly simple. You listen to the song. But for some of you, this might be a little trickier than it seems. Because for your dry listen, you want to listen to the entire song, ideally with headphones. But that's all you do. That means no checking your phone, no scanning Reddit or Twitter, no working on that hangnail. If you've never been one to just sit down and listen to an album the way you might read a book or watch a movie, then I'm excited for you. There's so much you can enjoy if you can just quiet your mind and listen. Now, you don't want to focus on any particular element too much. Don't get too thinky about it. What you're trying to do here is just kind of take in the song as a whole. Just listen to it as it is without too much mental effort. Okay, on to the next method, and this one will be a little bit more of a challenge for your ear. This is exactly what it sounds like, and I know it seems really obvious. Again, listening to individual instruments can actually reveal a lot more about a song than you might think, and this can actually prove a little tricky. I'd really recommend listening to the song as a whole first, just simply to identify what instruments are actually playing on the track, and also how many vocalists might be on the recording. Whether the instruments on the track are real or synthesized, it really doesn't matter. You also might notice instruments that you really never thought were on the track that you're listening to. It's pretty cool. There are a lot of elements in a lot of songs that are kind of hiding in plain sight. Something that's often overlooked is auxiliary percussion. So basically anything that you hit that's not part of a standard kit. Bongos, a gong, claves. You'd be surprised how easily that stuff can fall away, especially if you're listening to your music on a laptop or just through your phone speakers. For example, I didn't notice that there was heavy use of steel drums in the Police song, Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic, which is kind of embarrassing, because they're right in front of your face. It's like that video where they're asking you to count how many times a basketball is passed back and forth, and you're so focused on counting that you miss a gorilla that walks through the entire scene. If you haven't seen it, I sound crazy, but check it out, it's kind of cool. So much like the dry listen, put your phone on silent, give your dog something to chew, but this time, just focus on what the bass is doing. Maybe the bass line is exactly mirroring what's going on guitar, or maybe it's a really active bass line and it's going all over the place. Also, if you're having trouble hearing certain instruments, especially bassy instruments like a bass guitar, try messing around with your media player's EQ. Depending on your headphones, sometimes the bass can be a little bit hidden or a little bit muddied by the sub bass. So if you just want to identify it so that you can then kind of catch it next time you listen, just poke around in your EQ. It's not going to bite, I promise. You can always reset it. That's actually giving me an idea. Maybe I should do a video, demystifying EQ and its setup. I know it can seem really daunting and intimidating, and it is a bit technical, but the basics are pretty easy to grasp. And especially if you're using something like Spotify, EQ is split into just a few bands. You can split it into a ton of bands. Like if you're on Logic Pro or something. That's daunting. But let me know in the comments if that's something that might interest you. Oh, and just one more tip to help you with your instrumental analysis. There are AI programs that can completely separate the instruments in a song. Very neat and featurey and a little terrifying. I don't know why. Now, don't worry, you don't need to know any music theory in order to dive into this, I promise. I'll really do my best to make this approachable, but also not a snooze fest for people who know a little bit of musical jargon. Also, keep in mind that the parameters I'm going to be focusing on are culturally relative. This is how we, in the tradition of Western music, not country Western, but like the vague idea of the West. So for my fellow musicology nerds out there, I hear you, but I'm going to be using mostly colloquial terms where I can. But we will be getting a little bit more academic with the next step, I promise. Okay, let's start with rhythm. I think colloquially it can be confused a lot with a song's beat, and although a song's beat and its rhythm are intimately connected, they're not the same thing. My favorite working definition of rhythm is that it's the relationship between sounds and time in music. Think about a funk song. In funk, every instrument has a distinct rhythmic purpose. As James Brown would often say, every instrument is a drum. So when you're listening to a song, think about how all the instrumentalists and the vocalists are sharing their time together. All of this, the way all of these sounds work together in time and repetition, this is a song's rhythm. This is how you can listen to a song through a rhythmic lens, so to speak. So next, of course, we have melody. Think of this as the part of a song that you can whistle in the shower. And it doesn't just have to be a vocal melody. It can be an instrumental part. It could be bass, it could be guitar, it could be synth, it could be horns. In its most basic form, a melody is just a sequence of notes. Musicians use these sequences of notes to create something pleasing, something that you'll remember, a hook. You can really develop your ear by listening to how different melodies interact with one another, or also how they can seem in lockstep with, or just floating above, the song's rhythm or beat. For example, there's a form of music in the Western classical tradition called a fugue, where different melodies, sometimes as many as 5, are being played by the same instrument. Not at the same time, but kind of overlapping, and somehow it doesn't sound like one big garbled mess. And that's because each melody is placed very carefully, almost like a puzzle piece, so that it can either complement or respond to another melody present in the song, or piece. Songs have vocals. Sorry, I felt like I had to correct that, because every music teacher and every musicology professor I've ever had would be furious. Well, probably not. The last element of music that I'll mention is harmony. Now this one can be a little bit difficult to suss out if you've never played a musical instrument, but at its core, it's a very simple idea. It's just different individual notes being played at the same time to create something that's more than the sum of its parts. Now harmonies can take many forms. They can be the chords that you might play on a guitar or a piano, or they can be a rich vocal harmony. They can even be 2 cymbals hit at the same time that have slightly different resonances. 2 or more sounds played at the same time, harmony. If you want some harmony that's easy to pick out and kind of separate in your head, I would highly recommend listening to something that has very clear vocal harmonies. That could be something like the song It's Alright by Huey Lewis and the News, or Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys. Okay, our next listening method is a little bit more academic than our menu so far, but I promise it's super interesting and it's not too difficult to grasp. If you're really trying to broaden the spectrum of music that you listen to, this is a really great method for you. It's called the thick listening method. So believe it or not, thick listening is not when you eat an entire box of cinnamon rolls while listening to the Doobie Brothers. It's all about what you can hear with and without context. This way of listening to music is meant to introduce the listener to an ethnomusicological perspective. And as I said before, it's really best applied to music that falls outside of the traditional Western canon of music. That's music from other cultures, religions, minority groups. This is essentially music that you lack cultural context for, be it Mongolian throat singing, or gaitero music from the Colombian Andes, or Indigenous Canadian music that's meant to accompany Haudenosaunee dances. This process involves 2 steps. First, a dry listen of the song, without the title or origin of the song being presented. And I know what you're thinking, how am I supposed to play these songs without seeing what the title or the artist is? Well, you can do this with a music buddy or a partner, or you can just find a non-Western music compilation playlist and play it on shuffle with a notebook handy. In Spotify, there's a recent listens tab or something like that where you can see the history of every song that you've listened to. And that's going to be really important in just a second. Now, for best effect, you really have to agree not to peek at the song at all. Even a glance at the cover art can reinforce biases and opinions about people or places that this music might be from. So while you're listening to these songs, I want you to write notes about the sounds that you hear. What instruments are being used, or what instruments you think might be being used? Are there strings? Is there percussion? Even things like the space it was recorded in. Does it sound like it was recorded in a giant Byzantine chapel or a tiny log cabin? Also, make sure to number the songs that you're listening to, because this is going to make the next step a lot easier. The second step, the reveal. You can now go through your recently listened songs and find the artist and song names. Now, moving through the list, look up each song that you heard and add that cultural context that you're missing. Find the purpose of the music. Is it music for worship, for dancing, for partying? Where did it originate geographically? How has the music in this genre changed over time? And here's why this method can be so interesting. For example, you may realize that the Mongolian folk song that you just listened to has a very rhythmic, plodding quality to it. You might feel like momentum is building or something like that. And of course, you've written this all down during step one. But during the reveal, you'll learn that a lot of these songs are about riding horses, or are supposed to sonically emulate the sound of being on horseback. You know what? This has got me kind of fired up. I'm gonna include a link to a Mongolian folk song in the description. Please watch it. So cool. Now with your new sense of context, your notes are given meaning, or maybe you're way off, and that's okay too. This exercise can really reveal some interesting assumptions that we have about music itself, or the role of music, how it should sound, how happy music should sound, how sad music should sound, how music for dancing should sound. It really opens your eyes to how many of these things are culturally relative. They're things that we take for granted. But now with a third listen to that same piece of music, you might find that you really enjoy the listening experience a lot more. If not, just have a more developed sense of understanding of what you're listening to. And this is by no means a perfect exercise, and I don't think it's intended to be. It's really impossible to shed all of your cultural baggage. But I think it's a great way to shine some light on sounds that might sound at first mysterious or even just random. But of course, they're not random, we just don't have the cultural context to understand it. Think about the familiarity principle. If you really want to dig into that, I really talk about it at length in my NPC music taste video. But basically, your brain prefers sounds that it's used to. It's a lot easier to predict what's coming next. And this doesn't even mean for songs that you've heard before. It works for entire styles and genres of music. If you're used to rock and roll, you understand where the song's gonna go usually. The same with blues, or hip hop, or country. But if you've never listened to jazz before, and you dive right into some really complex jazz, it's gonna sound totally random. Okay, so that one was pretty heavy, and I did promise some lighter fare towards the end. So for our fifth listening method, we actually kind of have two silly listening games. And you won't find these on the internet. These are totally a David Hughes invention. Now these games also have to do with shifting your perspective, but there's none of the lofty academic goals of thick listening. So one of my favorite ways to listen to music is to listen like a hater. I know that sounds really wacky, but it's a great way to listen to some of your favorite songs in a new light. I like to pick a song that I love, like Golden Brown by the Stranglers. Listen to it. I'm sure if you don't recognize the name, you'll definitely recognize how it sounds. Now I'll spend a minute or two pretending that Golden Brown is my least favorite song of all time. I don't like the Stranglers. I don't even like that decade or genre of music. It's boring, it's monotone, it's self-indulgent maybe. I really try and internalize all these totally fair reasons for not liking the song. Now I know this seems ridiculous, but you really can deepen your enjoyment of the songs that you love by doing this. It also helps you stretch your empathy for other people. Like, I'm right because I listen to this music, they're wrong because they listen to that music. It's kind of like an antidote for that way of thinking. In kind of a self-congratulatory way, I guess, you can also reveal places where you've developed a more complicated and acquired taste. Again, I love jazz and all its quirky improvisational glory, but I can really see how its winding, unpredictable melodies can turn some people off. And for another listening game, you can really just flip this on its head. Pretend to be the world's biggest fan of a genre or an artist that you cannot stand, and really try and get into the mindset of this hypothetical person that you've created. Try not to create a two-dimensional version of, I don't know, a Katy Perry fan. Actually try and think about what a Katy Perry fan might want from their music. And this is not meant to crap on Katy Perry at all. It's just a random example. And then just give it a listen. Listen to an entire song. Now, you'll probably still walk away not liking it, but you might find elements of the song that you like. Or maybe now you have a new guilty pleasure, I don't know. If you want, you can check out my video on learning to love the genres that you hate. If you want to rehabilitate your opinion on certain styles of music that you really can't stand. It was a really fun video to make. For me, it was country that I had to get used to, and I found some of my favorite songs of all time during that process. So there we are, 5 great ways to listen to music. I really hope you give them a try. Let me know what you think, or if you've made any discoveries, or if any of these really didn't work for you. If you like content like this, please consider subscribing. But that's all for now. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.